Something unusual is unfolding tonight along the border between the United States and Canada. Not a military standoff, not a financial collapse, a bridge. Yet the fight over this one bridge is quickly turning into a test of power, leverage, and the future of North America's economic alliance. Because the President of the United States, Donald Trump, has just raised the possibility of blocking it. Not stopping construction. That part is basically done. The towers are standing, the cables are stretched across the Detroit River. Billions have already been spent. What's being questioned now is something far more powerful than concrete and steel: access. In modern geopolitics, infrastructure doesn't matter if governments don't allow it to function. A bridge can exist physically and still be shut down economically. That is exactly the scenario suddenly being discussed around the Gordie Howe International Bridge, the massive new crossing that connects Windsor, Ontario to Detroit, Michigan. On the surface, this project was supposed to be a straightforward upgrade to one of the busiest trade corridors in the world. But in the past few days, it has transformed into something much bigger: a pressure point, a bargaining chip, and potentially a signal that even the closest allies are willing to test each other's limits. To understand why this matters, you have to understand the location. The Detroit-Windsor corridor isn't just another border crossing. It's one of the central arteries of the North American economy. Roughly a quarter of all trade between the United States and Canada moves through this region. Every single day, thousands of trucks carry auto parts, industrial components, agricultural products, chemicals, and advanced manufacturing equipment back and forth across this narrow stretch of river. And here's something most people don't realize: many of those goods cross the border multiple times before a finished product ever reaches a customer. A car assembled in Michigan might contain parts stamped in Ontario, electronics built in Ohio, transmissions assembled in Canada, and materials shipped from multiple states and provinces. Modern manufacturing isn't national anymore, it's integrated. The border exists politically, but economically the system runs like one giant machine. That's exactly why the new bridge was built. For decades, this region has depended heavily on a single crossing, the Ambassador Bridge. It has carried enormous volumes of trade since the 1920s, but it's aging, privately owned, and increasingly strained by modern logistics demands. Governments on both sides of the border knew relying on one primary choke point was risky. A shutdown, a disaster, or even major congestion could ripple through the entire auto industry. So the idea behind the Gordie Howe Bridge was simple: add capacity, add reliability, and modernize how goods move between two of the most industrialized regions on the continent. But there's a twist that makes this project politically explosive. Canada paid for most of it. Ottawa committed more than $4 billion to finance construction, including major infrastructure on the American side of the river. Canadian taxpayers essentially funded a project that physically connects to the United States, something that rarely happens in international infrastructure. Why would they do that? Because for Canada, the stability of cross-border trade is existential. Their economy is deeply tied to the American market. Ensuring that goods can move quickly and predictably isn't just convenient, it's essential to national economic security. In other words, Canada wasn't just building a bridge, it was investing in the long-term stability of the entire North American industrial system. For years, the project moved forward with relatively little drama. Engineers built the towers, massive cables were installed, road networks were designed to handle modern freight traffic. The expectation was that once finished, the bridge would quietly become part of the everyday infrastructure that keeps the continent moving. Then the political temperature changed. Donald Trump began questioning the arrangement, arguing that the United States should be fully compensated and suggesting the project may not have adequately benefited American industry. He pointed to concerns about materials and broader negotiations with Canada, raising the possibility that federal approvals tied to the bridge could become leverage. And that's when alarms started going off across industries. Because the real power over a border crossing isn't just who paid for it or who built it. The real power lies in who controls the operational switch. Customs processing, security certifications, federal border clearances, those are controlled by Washington. If those systems aren't activated, trucks don't move, trade doesn't flow, the bridge becomes a structure without an economy. That's why analysts immediately started describing this situation using a very specific term: choke point control. You don't need to own infrastructure if you control access to it, and suddenly that access was being discussed in the context of political negotiations. Canada's response came quickly but carefully. Prime Minister Mark Carney didn't escalate the rhetoric. Instead, he emphasized cooperation. Yes, Canada financed the majority of the project, but American workers helped build it. American steel was used in construction. The state of Michigan shares ownership. The bridge, he argued, is a symbol of partnership, not imbalance. On the surface, it was diplomacy, but beneath that tone was a clear signal. Blocking or delaying the project would hurt both countries. because the industries that rely on this crossing are deeply intertwined. Take the auto sector, for example. Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis operate production systems that stretch across the border. Components move constantly between factories in Ontario and Michigan. In many cases, a single vehicle's parts might cross that river several times during assembly. Those movements are timed down to the minute. Factories operate on just-in-time logistics. That means parts arrive exactly when they're needed, minimizing storage costs and maximizing efficiency. It works beautifully when everything runs smoothly. But if a crossing slows down or becomes uncertain, the system can break fast. Assembly lines stop, suppliers panic, freight routes become congested, costs surge, production targets collapse. Within weeks, the financial consequences can run into billions of dollars. That's exactly the kind of scenario the Gordie Howe Bridge was designed to prevent. It provides redundancy, more lanes, more efficient customs processing, a backup route if other infrastructure fails. In short, it strengthens the resilience of North America's manufacturing backbone, which is why the possibility of political interference has so many people paying attention. Because this isn't just about traffic, it's about trust. For decades, the U.S.-Canada relationship has been one of the most stable economic partnerships in the world. Companies built supply chains assuming that stability would continue indefinitely. Investments were made, factories were built, entire industries grew around the assumption that goods would move freely across that border. If that assumption starts to weaken, businesses won't just complain, they will adapt. Supply chains could shift to different regions. Companies may move production to avoid uncertainty. Investors might reconsider where new factories are built. And once those decisions are made, they can reshape economic geography for decades. That's why global analysts are watching this situation closely, because what's happening here reflects a much larger trend. Around the world, infrastructure is increasingly being treated as strategic leverage. Ports, pipelines, shipping routes, data cables, rail networks, whoever controls them has influence over trade flows and economic stability. We've seen this dynamic play out in Europe with energy pipelines, in Asia with maritime routes, in Africa with port investments. Now, the question is whether it's beginning to appear inside alliances that were once considered unshakable. The Gordie Howe Bridge dispute sits right in the middle of that question. If the project opens smoothly, it reinforces the traditional model of cooperation. Two countries invest in shared infrastructure because both sides benefit. Trade expands, economies grow, the system works. But if political pressure begins to interfere, even temporarily, it changes how future projects will be viewed. Countries will start asking new questions. What happens if the other side decides to use access as leverage? What protections exist? How much dependence is too much? Those questions don't just affect bridges. They affect energy grids, manufacturing hubs, transportation corridors, and digital infrastructure. In that sense, the stakes of this story are much larger than the Detroit River. Right now, the bridge itself is almost finished. Massive white towers rise above the water. Cables stretch across the sky. Roadways are being prepared for the trucks that will soon carry billions of dollars in goods. From an engineering perspective, the job is nearly done. But politically, the final chapter hasn't been written yet. What happens next will determine whether this project becomes a symbol of cooperation or a warning about the new reality of global power. Because if allies begin treating shared infrastructure as bargaining tools, it signals a shift in how the world's most stable relationships operate. And once that shift begins, it doesn't stop at one bridge. It spreads, which is why people far beyond Canada and the United States are paying attention right now. Investors, manufacturers, governments, strategic planners, they all understand something important. This isn't really about a bridge. It's about whether the systems holding the Western economy together are as stable as everyone assumed. The concrete is set, the cables are locked, the structure stands ready, but the real decision about this bridge is still being negotiated.